making money is actually not that hard. It's who you do it with and the value that you're creating that makes it all worthwhile. Whatever I do next, I want to do it with a founding team from the beginning. I think I've really come to appreciate that who you do the work with and the impact you have is more important than pretty much everything else.
So I kind of thought, this is fun for a little extra fun for me because while I've had a lot of conversations with you over the last 5 years or so, or whenever it was that I got exposed to your company, Actionable, because right now I can't even remember how long ago that was, but it was a while back.
Yeah, and I don't remember how you got connected with us in the first place. Do you remember?
I do. I actually went to a live demonstration in Austin,
Okay.
Texas.
So that's more like 7 or 8 years ago, Bill.
Yeah, when you were sending folks around. And it's interesting
Yeah.
because I connected with three or four of the people that were at that meeting, and we ended up, getting together regularly and trying to help each other out for a while. It was really cool. Um, so even though I know you through Actionable and now through some other things, I don't really know that much about you, Chris Taylor, and how
Who is the
you,
mystery?
right, and how you got where you are. But I'm wondering, like, we've been really talking a lot about the inner game on this
Yep.
podcast. Is there a particular mindset for you or way of looking at your work and what you do that you feel like either changed the game or really enabled you to build something successful?
What a great question. Normally open with, where are you from? This is going deep fast, Bill. I love it. I think that, yeah, if I think about that, there's probably two parts. And I would say that the transition timing, and I'm not unique in this, but the birth of my first child put me on a different path than I had been on previously. And then the birth of my second child sort of accelerated that path and brought some more guardrails to it. So I think two things. One, time suddenly becomes an extremely precious commodity, right? For everyone that has kids, you know how that goes. And it's hard to imagine life before kids right after. You're like, what did I do with those 168 hours that I had complete control over each week when now I feel like I've got about 4, right? So what did I do with that? So part number one was I still consider myself to be a nice guy, but I went from being a nice guy who was accessible to everyone around everything to being really ruthless in my relationships and activities. So that happened with my first child. Shortly after my first child, going, no, I've got extremely limited time here. I want to prioritize time with family. I'm also not willing to give up, my aspirations with the business. And so something's got to give. And what had to give was the things that Derek Sivers' expression of it's either a hell yeah or a no, right? Just really leaning into that and being unapologetic about it. I used to make up excuses and these like very convoluted stories about why I couldn't be a part of something. And I've just moved to no, thank you. Really appreciate you thinking of me. It's not a priority for me right now. So that took a lot of work internally to be comfortable with that, to not feel like I was being an asshole. But sorry, am I allowed to swear on this? But with that, so that was probably a couple of years from intention to living that mindset, that belief. And then the second part that sort of goes part and parcel with that, but really anchored in with my second child about 4 years ago, was this mantra that consistency compounds or compounds, depending on where you live. And that idea that if I'm only going to do a select number of things, I'm going to do them consistently and consciously so that I'm getting better each cycle, whether it's a little bit better or a lot better. I'm not just going through the motions. I'm leaning in to really hone the craft. And I think those two exercises, which were really born out of necessity or at least prioritization, I can see the trajectory of the business sort of mapping almost perfectly to, growth curve one and then growth curve two, with those two pieces being lived. So thank you for the question. And yeah, I'm standing by that answer.
That's a great answer, Mike. Or Bill, you're muted. um,
I love
I
the
love that.
consistency piece. Um,
Mhm.
are you are you naturally consistent? Like, is that something that some people are just good at that, right? Good at routine and being consistent
Yeah.
at stuff. Is that something you really had to learn, or is that somewhat natural to you?
No, I 100% had to learn that, Bill. I think it's, even you've already got me in a very introspective mood 6 minutes into this conversation. But even that idea of, is it natural to you? I think, I think I think we're far more adaptive as a species and as individuals than we maybe give ourselves credit for, right? It's the idea of, people tell me, I get up at 4 a.m. People tell me all the time, well, I'm not a morning person. I can never do that. Like, I went to film school. I used to drink and do drugs until 3 o'clock in the morning. And then I'd get up at whenever because I had no schedule and no priority in my life. And I really prided myself on that, on being sort of anti culture, and that I would, zig when everyone else zagged, and I would do everything my own way. And that was a core part of my identity. And then, this was pre kids, but that started to shift when I realized that that wasn't serving me on the things that I now valued, right? That my values had shifted, and as a result, my behaviors needed to shift. And so the idea of this consistency compounds the discipline of actually staying the course with something through the dip, as Seth Godin calls it, um, was absolutely a learned skill. At one of the pivotal points for me on that was I did this thing called 75 hard, which some listeners may know. I did it for the first time 3 years ago. And for those who don't know, it's basically 75 consecutive days where you do a set of activities, and it's every day without exception, without apology. And if you miss one of the activities, one of the days, you start over. I'd tried a bunch of stuff in the past, from a discipline standpoint, and lasted a couple days and failed. The thing I liked about 75 hard in hindsight was that it had obviously very clear structure to it, but there's freedom within the frame. So, like, for example, you're supposed to do 2 exercises each day. They're 45 minutes each. One of them is outdoors, but that's it. It's not 75 burpees and then run 3 miles. Like, none of that. It's if you've, spent the last 10 years sitting on the couch eating potato chips, it could be a casual walk around the block for 45 minutes counts as a workout. Right. And so I really loved that freedom to experiment and be creative and innovative within a structure that worked for me. And then I saw the results, because 75 days is long enough that you establish habits in really all these areas. And so I've done that. I've done 75 hard every year for the last 3 years. I plan on continuing it indefinitely as a reconnection to that discipline. Um, but I think it takes, well, for me, it took a format that worked for my personality to make that shift, from really, really valuing freedom and spontaneity, to more structure, and then figuring out where spontaneity fits within that. Because I'm, certainly changed, but I'm not. I still love spontaneity. So how does that get built in?
Right. Yeah, I love that. I love that. We're not all born with this discipline and ability to be consistent, um, and turn that switch on. I mean, I can relate to that in that I have to really fight for the consistency piece. Bill and I talk about that a lot. The discipline consistency part doesn't come natural, and you
Yep.
have to do certain things to kind of put yourself in that state,
Yep.
and solidify that habit. And then you also said ruthless with your time and people
Yep.
and family, and how that kind of clicked when you had your kid, and setting boundaries is like another way to say that.
Yeah.
And I call myself a recovering people pleaser. I
Yeah.
definitely am in my head a lot about stuff like that. Is that something you have? Would you consider yourself a recovering people pleaser? Is that still in
Yeah.
you at all? Like, where does that? How have you created that ability to set those boundaries?
Yeah, I appreciate bringing that up, because as I'm reflecting on the conversation so far, I probably sound like someone that I'm or it's representing part of me, not all of me. I don't want to suggest that being ruthless means that I don't agonize over it every time when I'm saying no to somebody, right? Because I every time I'm like, oh, well, maybe I can't, maybe I don't need to sleep that hour. Like, legitimately, these are the things going through my head because I want to, because everything sounds interesting and exciting, and you never know what possibilities exist when you meet with people serendipitously and all that stuff. And so there's a couple of things that I've done. First of all, anyone looking for a good resource on our mental reframe, there's a book called 4,000 Weeks. That's just a really interesting perspective on life, and really helps to address the fact that you're saying no to an almost infinite number of things at every moment of the day, right? By choosing the one thing that you're doing, you're saying no to everything else. And that is quite literally the only choice that we have in life is the one thing that we're going to do in the next moment. And so getting comfortable with the fact that you're saying no to a million things, some of them are just more front and center than other things, was just a really helpful frame. And the book's beautifully written, and I recommend it. But then for me, I found that creating soft landings is really helpful because I don't want to say no. I just want to redirect, right? It's like jujitsu. So I don't want to say, people say, can I pick your brain? I'm just starting a consulting company. Can I pick your brain for 20 minutes? It's not really who I work with. And it's not like, yes, I've got lots to offer, but it's not going to advance the things that I've set for myself. So I created a resource, right? Like I literally recorded a Loom video with my top 10 mistakes that new consultants make. And so people reach out with that question, and I can say, hey, congratulations. I'm excited for you on your journey. I've actually got this resource. That'll be a great place for you. Here's the link. All the best. Right. And so it gives me a way to, I don't have to say no. I just don't have to do the thing they're asking. Right. So that, as an example, becomes really helpful.
That's awesome.
Thanks.
So many of every book that I've heard you mention on this podcast and other podcasts are some of my favorite books. I feel like our brains are very similar in the.
Are we related?
Yeah, it's very possible. We have a lot of similarities in what we like to learn about. It sounds like, I don't know what that world, like the Seth Godin, Good to Great. I haven't read 4,000 Weeks, but it's on my list. A bunch of those. 75 Hard. I haven't finished it, but I did start it years ago, and it's on my list. I've done another version of that called Fighter Bodies.
Well, we should actually address the book thing, Chris, because I've heard you talk about this, and it's part of your, at least the underpinnings of your company is, this wealth of information that you have digested through reading a million books. What happened to you? You're in film school, you're partying, you're waking up late, you're doing the thing, and then all of a sudden you become the avid eater of books and information. What were you looking for? Why did you go there? And what did you find?
Yeah, consumer of books. I like that. The destroyer of worlds. So, just to sort of balance this out. So I knew from the age of I thought from the age of 8 that I wanted to be a filmmaker. I fell in love with Steven Spielberg's story about childhood movies, and my mom bought me Steven Spielberg's biography on VHS and the whole thing. So I knew I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I also knew that I wanted to be an entrepreneur because I started my first company when I was 12. We made Devil Sticks. I don't know if you remember Devil Sticks, but it was like a little toy game thing that you could play. So we manufactured them and sold them. And that was my first taste of like, oh, this is really kind of cool, creating something out of nothing and bringing value to people that they're happy to part with their money for. And so I had these two parallel tracks running. And so I thought the perfect marriage of that would be a producer, where I could be involved in the film world, but also be creating product. Right. And so I went to film school, and while I was going to film school, I was continuing these entrepreneurial endeavors. And I ended up running a franchise in British Columbia, where I went to university, while I was in film school. And I was really good at it. So out of the company globally, I was one of the top 3 sort of branch owners. And I was making lots of money, more than my dad at the time. So it felt like just, this is as much money as anyone can possibly make. I don't know if that's entirely true, but there may have been a month or two where I was making more than my dad. And my dad's listening to this going, absolutely not. But But that was a problem for me, because that success went straight to my head, and I became this just completely untethered from reality manager, driving people on my team and all the things that we know in leadership you just do not do. I was doing those things and making big bets, not paying attention to my finances, all that stuff. So shockingly, the business collapsed under me, and I was like broke, like bones of my ass broke, because I'd been spending like I was a millionaire, while I was not. And so my parents, bless them, basically invited me / told me to move home and move into the basement to sober up in sort of all senses of the word. And I did that. I moved back. Originally, I said no, and then finally relented when my landlord kicked me out, and moved back across the country in my parents' basement. And I sort of went down there in the basement, rallying against the world and how everyone had done me wrong. And then thought, well, there's probably something I could have done differently. So let me start reading to figure out what that might be. And so I grabbed business books, and then I moved into personal development books, self-help books. Then I got no job at this point, and I'm used to sort of always doing stuff. And so I'm reading 4 or 5 books a week, and nothing was happening. No change in my life, still no job prospects, nothing going on. And I had one of those like palm to forehead moments where I realized that, right, yeah, it's not the consumption of the book. It's actually applying, the ideas from the book. And so I started this blog called Actionable Books. Well, back then it was called something else, but it became Actionable Books. And it was effectively a business book summary service, but it was different than other summaries. I hate summaries because I have a lot of love and respect for the written word. And I find that most summaries just suck all the flavor out of a book and leave sort of the carcass, right? The skeleton, the table of contents with a tiny bit of meat on it. And I didn't want to be that. And so Actionable Books was a more fulsome deep dive into one concept from the book and some practical ways that you could apply those concepts. And it was really just a, sort of a self-therapy tactic. I knew that I would never follow through on this commitment of, applying ideas from books if I didn't have some sort of accountability vehicle. And so Actionable Books and the weekly email that came out of it was really that. I committed to read a book a week for a year, take one idea from each book and put it into practice in my life, so that my hypothesis was that I could reinvent how I showed up in the world by making those 52 small behavioral changes. And it took off. People really liked it. So there, we got very quickly to a place, 30 or 40,000 people visiting the site each week, reading the summaries and interacting. Other people wanted to write summaries. I wasn't done because I realized I just scratched the surface on, all the wealth of information out there. And so it continued, and it grew to over 1,000 summaries. I wrote a couple hundred of those on the platform. And I could safely say it changed my life, right? Like that led me ultimately to my wife. It got me a job offer. It helped me launch a training company. All of that was very pivotal. That was almost 16 years ago that kicked off. So it's been a journey.
That's so cool. I have to ask, I don't know, I can't help myself. I have to ask a potentially stupid question. So bear with me. No such thing, Miles. Is there one book, not in any particular category, just anything, is there one book that kind of stands out? Like you would, I know it kind of varies on, it depends on the, what you're trying to do. But if you had maybe one book just to give to anyone, no matter what, is there one that kind of stands out as your favorite?
Yeah. I mean, to your point, the right book at the right time for the right person is the unlock key, right?
Yeah. Stupid question.
So no, not at all. I've got a couple that I'll give you, because no, I probably can't get it down to one, but I can get it to a short list, at least of the ones that were most impactful for me. But I think it's interesting because, I get asked that question or variations on it. And it's fascinating because the $1 Million Mind, is that what it's called? No, the 1 Minute Millionaire, it was called, was the book that kicked off this whole thing.
Wow.
And I don't think it's a very good book. Like honestly, if I look at it objectively, it's not a great book, but that doesn't matter because it was exactly what I needed at that moment.
Right.
And so I think this is the interesting bit, is there's some books like 4,000 Weeks, like most of the books that Dan Pink has written, that are just really solid books that, in my opinion, everyone can benefit from reading. But that may not be the thing that you need most right now, right? So a couple though. Drive by Dan Pink, I think, is really key in understanding human psychology, human motivation. Influence by Robert Del Cialdini is another one. I think if you can understand how humans tick, those are books worth reading,
Yeah.
because until the robots fully take over, we're still interacting with people, right? And knowing how people's brains work is a extremely useful skill.
It kind of goes back to the inner game and how important that is. Tactics and strategies and the things that the where the rubber meets the road becomes a lot easier when you understand the inner game for yourself and for others. I mean,
Yep.
That's business, that's marketing, that's copywriting, that's self-regulation, emotional intelligence, relationships with others. I mean,
with
it's
your
kind
spouse,
of
your children, right? Yeah,
right.
exactly. Like it crosses the business world and the human world. And that's another one is Switch by Dan and Chip Heath. Sits on the shoulders of a whole lot of really good research. I have a lot of respect for books that take deep research and make it accessible to most of us that are not going to read the PhD papers right on these things. And that's you might call it like pop psychology, but to me that's sometimes it's a derogatory term, this idea of pop psychology, and I think that's a shame, because it's making it popular, which is the whole point, right? Like if we can get more people thinking about this, that's a good thing, right?
Yeah. Once too many people are on one thing, it becomes uncool, and it is what it is.
Yeah. And then you do, I mean, there's danger to it because it's never telling the whole story, just out of, page count. And then you end up with people that have read Atomic Habits and feel like they know everything there is to know about behavior change, and not taking anything away from James Clear and the popularity of the book. It's an incomplete understanding of habit formation and behavior change. And it can be dangerous if someone aligns themselves with a single author and just like, this is the way, because you're basically taking one person's opinion or one person's thin slice of it, right?
Right, exactly.
Miles and I don't always do very well with discipline, consistency, and grinding our way through the creative process.
We're also tripped up with things like overwhelm, imposter syndrome, perfectionism, and lone wolf syndrome on a weekly basis, and it's not a good feeling.
So a couple years ago, we created The Box to solve our own problem. The Box is a container and community for creatives to stay accountable, do the work, and actually finish what they started. We help you prioritize your projects and create a box around it.
We co-work twice a week for 90 minutes and support you in bringing projects to the finish line. It's not teaching you anything new. It's giving you the structure to focus and create with what you already have.
Because amazing things happen on the other side of finished. Come try it out and see how it feels at theboxcommunity.com. Well, speaking of behavior change, so I didn't actually know this. So Actionable, your company, started as, you said, actionable books. So summaries.
Yep.
And then it moved into this, behavior change catalyst for consultants, consulting companies. How did this happen? And this is no small organization.
Yeah.
You have a lot of stuff going on, and it's grown exponentially since those 7 or 8 years ago when I first ran into it. And you are definitely not out in the world yelling. So there is some way that you did this where it grew. How did it become what it is? And then how did you actually manage to build it to the point where it is now?
Okay. So let's start with some anchors. So if we go with the from being business book summaries and the to being Actionable is a behavior change system that consultants and trainers and L&D departments use to support learners in applying what they learned and measuring the impact of that. So that's what we are now. And I continue to look for a more succinct soundbite to explain that. There's a couple sort of key steps along the way. I think but if I don't want to bury the lead. So I think the punchline to it, as cliche as this will sound, is active listening and curiosity would be the through line that took us from one to the other. So I launched Actionable Books based on a personal need for accountability, right, around putting these ideas into practice. that audience grew because we struck a vein. People liked that approach and the tone and maybe my writing, if I lean into that. A lot of them were consultants and trainers and coaches, because when we think about who consumes business books and personal development books, a lot of them are in the space, right? Which is a blessing and a curse, which we can come back to. But I had a lot of consultants suddenly, and I didn't really understand the training space. Again, I went to film school, entrepreneur. I don't come from the corporate world. I've never had a corporate role. I didn't know that space really at all. And I didn't really know that learning and development was like a function. This is a thing, right? And so that was my first sort of eye opener to that. Was I started this thing called Actionable Book Club, where people could write summaries and we'd gather and talk about them and then post them. And it was great for content creation, but it was a chance to connect with these people on a more human level. I also had a number of smaller companies typically asking me if I could come in and run a training based on Drive. And I go, well, I don't know how that works from a licensing standpoint, but what I can do is pull together my sort of synthesized view of intrinsic motivation based on these 6 different authors and these ideas, and I'll come run a training on that. I'd been a trainer just in sales prior, and I really enjoy teaching. My mom was a teacher. And so it sort of came naturally to me, and I enjoyed it. And I was relatively good at it, good enough that people kept hiring me back. So we went from book summary service to boutique training company while I'm building a relationship with consultants. And there was a moment around 2011 where I had a client call me up. So a training client call me up and say, hey, we'd love to have you come back in. I said, great. What do you want me to talk about? Like, oh, no, the same thing. Your content was awesome. We'd love to have that content again. I went, okay, so who's the audience then? I said, same people. No, they loved it. 6 months ago when you did it, they had a great time. And I had this just like heart sinking feeling of, what am I doing here? Like, I'm glad they like me, but I'm entertainment. Like, that's it. They're bringing me back in to entertain their people, because clearly nothing's changing. If it was, they wouldn't want me to do the same content, right? So there's something broken here. And so I became really obsessed with the industry and with is this widespread? Like, are trainers being brought in to entertain? Do they think that they're driving change while they're like, what is that about? And so I became really obsessed with turning ideas into action in a learning environment. So same principles as I've done with the book summary, but now applied in a corporate learning environment. And so I commissioned the build of this really lightweight, pretty janky piece of tech that would, I haven't used the word janky in about 8 years, so there you go. But piece of tech that would allow participants to make a commitment to a change and then track their progress and give me visibility into that. Other consultants wanted that and said, this is great. I want that thing for my own work. I'd also built a bunch of workshops inspired by these books, and they wanted that too. And I took a look at it and thought, well, I like training and I'm good at it, but I'm not world class at it. And honestly, my passion right now is solving this multi-billion-dollar problem around how do we make change happen consistently in corporate learning. And so I decided that I would close down the training company and I would support consultants in their work. They could do the world-class facilitation. I'd be behind the scenes, equipping them with tools to make that easier, faster, and more impactful. And so that was really the beginning of Actionable as it really is in sort of 2011, 2012. And then we went all in on the tech around measurement. So looking at impact, behavior change impact specifically, and linking it to business priorities. So we could actually show corporate clients that, yeah, the training was great. People loved it. You already had that data. Here's the behaviors they shifted. That's new. And here's how those behaviors are aligned to your strategic priorities. That's really new. And now we've got the attention of the executive going, well, wait a second. I've always considered training to be an expense. Now I'm actually starting to see the connection to this being an investment because it's moving the needle on the priorities that matter to me. And then the pandemic happened. And the HR L&D function went through about 10 years of growth in 2 out of necessity, right? They had to figure out all these new things. They want to work from home and all that. But because of the emphasis on people around the planet during that sort of 18 months, 2 year period, suddenly HR is at the executive table, right? They're being asked stuff. And it's becoming very clear in looking at the HR function that they've got a lot of data, but it's very navel gazy. That's a technical term. It's very much about completion rates, and like particularly in the L&D function, completion rates and time spent on videos and attendance. It's like, well, okay, but that's like saying, we spent money on Google. It's like, or Google ads. Like, great. Did it do anything? Oh, I don't know. We don't actually track that. Okay. Like, no marketing department worth their salt would get away with that. But L&D, that's what was happening, right? People attended our training. They liked it. Good. Did it make any impact? I don't know. And so that became very obvious. And we went from playing with just the vanguard in the HR L&D function to more mainstream, where they started saying, well, we need this. We need proof of impact. So Actionable seems to be the only player actually doing this. And that's still largely true, that we're certainly one of the premier behavior change measurement systems, and specifically in supporting consultants and their clients. So in that vein. So I think through the whole thing, doing that assessment of where am I world class, who else can I collaborate with? It's one of the key themes in there. Second is just listening closely to what people are actually asking for. Third is a dash of luck. I hate to call the pandemic lucky for us, but there's an element to that, right? It really sped up the timeline. And we're by no means where I think we can go to. So we're certainly not done yet. I don't want to give that perspective that we're sitting on top of the world here. So lots of room to grow.
Where do you see it going?
I'm really curious about the friction points right now and how we can eliminate those. I feel like you're not allowed to run a technology company without mentioning AI at least once in an interview. So there's an element of that in our current and near future. Some of the friction points are education based. So for example, learning participants use Actionable to make a commitment to a behavior change that they're going to make based on the content they just experienced. It works best when those commitments, those behavior changes, are chosen from a list of options and then modified by the individual, which means that somebody needs to create those commitment options in the first place. And so the consultant does it, or the L&D department does it, or the participant does it in the room. There's a learning curve. It's short, but it's there, around how to craft a commitment that's actually going to support and drive change. But we have a strong methodology around that. We teach it. We've taught it to literally thousands of people. We could teach it to a machine learning system and have it be able to take whatever someone inputs and generate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, cool. That's one example, but that's the type of stuff that we're playing with. I believe, okay, we'll go a bit futurist here. AI, deepfakes, online immersive experiences are going to be amazing in so many facets, and I believe are going to continue to further reinforce the desire for in real life human to human connection. Partially because we want to know that what we're experiencing is real, right? And so, I hear pundits talking about VR and AR being the death of classroom cohort training. I think it's the opposite. I think we're going to see a pendulum swing. It might go down for a bit, but it'll come back with a vengeance, because at the end of the day, we're human beings. We want to connect with other human beings. We want to be able to sort of, I see you, I understand you. And so that I believe that that's there to stay, and it needs to continue to improve in efficacy, right? It needs to be beneficial for the individual. It needs to be beneficial for the organization. It needs to be measurable, because everything else is. And so if this isn't, it's a nice to have expense as opposed to a critical part of achieving our strategic plans.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thanks.
I want to go back for a second and maybe just jump back and then come right back. But from a timeline perspective, I think we jumped over this, and I was really curious. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you had like a 2-year stint of podcasting, or at least interviewing.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about like how that came to be and how you were able to get, in front of Gary Vee and Seth Godin.
Sure. So curiosity and collaboration. That can be our theme for the episode.
Nice.
So when I was doing these book summaries, I'd gotten in the habit, there was no monetization. Well, there was a very half-baked monetization strategy around the book summaries. It was really and truly me, right? Like it was almost an act of selfishness. I don't care if anyone reads these. I just need to do this to know that it's actually working, which is sometimes the best way to do something because you're not trying to cater to a particular audience. Anyway, as I read the books, and because they were ungated, I would send an email to each of the authors after the summary was published. It was a form email, and I'll tell you what it said. It would say, "Hey Seth, I read your book, blank, loved your book, wrote about your book." 3 lines. The wrote about your book would be hyperlinked. It would take them to the summary. "I really appreciate everything you're doing. Thanks for the great work. Keep it up. Chris." Send it. I'd say honestly, probably north of 90% of the time, people would reply back. And sometimes I get these like, you never know how you're going to hit somebody with an email like that. You get people being like, "I was about to give up on this career as a writer, and thank you so much." That was rare, but it happened, and it was kind of cool. Seth was one of those guys, and this is still true to today. If you email Seth, he will write you back. He's sort of globally renowned. He's got, I don't even know how many people on his mailing list, and he responds to everything. It's very brief, but he responds. And so we'd built this pattern up where I would send that. He'd reply with a "bravo!" or "great, thanks," or "keep it up," or whatever. And then I would reply back usually with something quite fanboy and long, and then he wouldn't reply to that. And it was a game we played. But great. When I finished, I'm trying to remember what it even was at the time. It was the book before Linchpin. I finished it. And I had finished his entire canon. I'd written about 12, I think at the time, 12 or 14 of his books. And instead of my usual email, after the "read your book, loved your book, wrote about your book," I wrote, "And I realized I finished everything you've written. And I'm also realizing that the stuff that just came out is actually 2 years old compared to what's happening in your brain because, publishing. If you're ever open to it, I would love to have a real conversation with you and find out what's going on in your head right now." And then about 7 minutes later, I got an email back from him saying, "Yeah, sure. Hastings on the Hudson. How's Tuesday?" So I'm in Toronto. I think I'd been to the States once at that point. Like I'm, not a traveler. And I say Toronto. It wasn't Toronto. It was like a little town outside of Toronto. I'm going, okay. And so I rented a video camera, like a full shoulder mount, sort of HD tape video camera, and booked a plane ticket to Manhattan and a car to drive up to, because I didn't know what I was doing, to drive up to Hastings on the Hudson. And then I thought, well, if I'm buying this plane ticket and I'm going to New York, I should see if there's any other authors that I've recently written about that would be open. And so it's funny you mentioned those two, because Gary Vaynerchuk was the other one. And he had just published Crush It. It was just starting to get some notoriety. He had like a 22-person agency in Midtown. And he said, yeah, because he said, yeah, to everybody back then. And I didn't really know. Again, sometimes you just don't know these things, right? It's like I met Simon Sinek right before his Golden Circle talk came out, and I interviewed him. Like there's certain things that just serendipitous timing, and then you ride the wave a little bit with them. But so they both agreed. And then, so I interviewed them both. My wife her girlfriend at the time came with me. And then I had these 2 interviews in the can. I hadn't been planning on doing any sort of interview series, but now I had them, and I'd gone in person to do it. So I'd set this precedent and says, I'll turn this into a thing. And so I just started reaching back out to the authors whose work I'd really admired, and had some, again, at the time, I didn't really appreciate what a get some of them were, right? It was people that I admired that I'd written about, and now I've got an ask that's also kind of a give. And so I spent the next 2 years traveling around North America, mostly in the US, literally flying city to city with this shoulder mount camera with no lights, terrible sound. Like the quality of this thing compared to the cost that went into it is not, we don't share. I had bizarre hair at the time and like weird scraggly thing. But it was fun, and I loved it. And then once I started to wise up a little bit to what the business was turning into, I stopped doing it live and moved to web interviews and continued it for another couple of years. And then just sort of wound it down. Projects have their seasons, but I do miss the in-person a little bit. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I bet. You ever see doing it again?
Yeah, maybe. I think I'd really taken the mindset that I'm going to be a student back then. And so there was no business motive to it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why it worked, and why people were so open to meeting with me. Is there,
Yeah.
you know, it wasn't the illusion of no agenda. There was no agenda. In hindsight, I wish there'd been a little more agenda. Like, this was sort of the beginning of YouTube, you know, followership. They were talking like 2011, right? 2010, 2011.
Wow.
And I look at some people now with hundreds of millions of views that basically did the exact same thing, but did it intelligently. So anyway, I think maybe I've become, you know, that ruthless focus at this stage doesn't allow me to do it just because. And so I'd need a business case for it, which would take something away from it potentially a little bit. So I don't know.
Yeah.
There'll be a time and season for it, I think, again, maybe when the kids are a little older.
So you talked a little bit about where Actionable could be going.
Yeah.
What's next for Chris Taylor in his ruthless, focus?
Yeah, the $1 million question. I had one of those incredibly cliche, turned 40 a couple of years ago, and had that. I was not expecting it, but like that, I don't know, I guess midlife crisis, maybe quarter life crisis at the stage we're at now. It's just as a species, and just like that, like existential. What am I doing with my life? And, you know, is this how I want to spend my remaining days? It's probably around the time I read 4,000 weeks too. Be warned, fellow travelers, be warned. And so I've had lots of time to think about that. And the short answer is I still don't think I know what I want to be when I grow up, Bill. I'm really enjoying the work that I do. I want to, whatever I do next, if there's a next, I want to do it with a founding team from the beginning. When I look back at the hardest parts on the journey, it was when I was feeling most alone in the business, or because I didn't have a partner to sort of go, no, that's stupid. Don't do that. I ran down a multi-million-dollar path that was actually a cliff. So I think I've really come to appreciate that who you do the work with and the impact you have is more important than pretty much everything else, right? Like, it's, again, I appreciate how this probably sounds to people, but making money is actually not that hard. It's who you do it with and the value that you're creating that makes it all worthwhile. So again, that in mind, I think I've been through the trenches long enough that whatever I do next is going to make money, he says, somewhat naively, potentially. But doing it with the right people is what it comes down to. Now, that said, I also have no plans to exit Actionable anytime soon. So, right. So we'll see. I'm taking more control over continue to take more control over my calendar. So this year, I have Mondays meeting free, fully booked for content creation. So I enjoy it, and I need the white space to do that. I've got Fridays are dedicated to a coaching program that I run sort of on the side, which, Bill, we're hanging out there. Yep. And then afternoons are usually quite flexible. So it's either social or, I was going to say social or doing a podcast like this, but this is social for me. So,
yeah, it is.
Yeah. And then, done at 5, just becoming a bit boring in that regard. So, but
I love that.
You said you don't know what you want to be when you grow up, which is funny. And also there's so much truth to that, because it's like, we have to be this thing. And, I think I have a midlife crisis like every week, just a small one, because part of it's because I do so many different things.
Track. It's like every other week, and you call me and you're in the middle of it. Yeah.
That's not bad. Then we're improving.
Yeah, absolutely. You're doing great.
No, but I think it's this weird control thing where we have to be something and we have to feel good about that thing, and it has to like make sense to the world, yada yada, like a label, identity. Yeah. What do we do if you don't do something that's super clear and cool? Then, oh my gosh, what are you going to do? You're lost. So what I'm kind of hearing in the way you're talking is it sounds like you've been good at leaning into things organically, kind of following your curiosity, finding value, like seeing gaps and opportunities, and then focusing on that and building value around that, making money for yourself, and also surrounding yourself with the right people. So I think what I'm kind of taking away from this is that that's really what matters. Not so much like, what what you're doing and who you are as an identity is probably going to change. It can change from time to time. It's
100%.
dynamic and evolving.
Yeah.
But I think the kind of pillars are like who you want to be with, and the kind of topics, the things that you want to work on, the problems you want to solve. So it's
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah. I think, yes, I think I feel like I'm just sort of like a wind up toy. I got all these cliches coming out of my mouth, but it's your eulogy spends very little time talking about what you did and talks way more about who you were. And it's spoken by people that spend time with you, that you loved and loved you in return. Right. And then, so there's the whole thing for me is if we're creating value for people, whether that's material or monetary value, or whether it's connections, or whether it's just making them feel better, like you just they had a conversation with you and they left it better than they came into it. If we're continuing to do that, then the opportunities for wealth creation come right through that. The piece that, as you're saying, I see opportunities or places to create value. I think, thank you for saying that, and I think that's true. And one of the things that I've really been working on, speaking of the inner game, is letting go of what I think is a good idea that the market's not responding to pretty quickly. Because I think we make things harder than they need to be. And the idea of being in that place of flow where, sort of, and you hear it from typically quite wealthy people, where it's like, it just flows, abundance abounds, right? It just sort of comes to me. Like, cool. But you worked really hard to develop that. And I'm not there, but I'm working really hard to develop that. Of just because I think something's good, I try to share it as quickly as possible in its unfiltered form. Before I build anything now, I'm working on basically marketing hooks. Like, if I can put this on the web and say, hey, here's the problem that for these people that you can solve without doing this thing that you might expect, I just put that out and see what sort of response it gets. Because if it doesn't get immediate response, it's really not worth pursuing in my experience, because you're going to spend a whole lot of time and energy trying to push that boulder up the hill when it could be so much easier. You hear stories about people that had a $0 to $3 million business in 12 months. It's, in my opinion, yes, they had to operate with excellence on that, but that didn't happen because they were excellent operators. It happened because they found the need that people already wanted to fill, and they provided a solution and made it easier for people to buy it. But it's about making things easier for others, for yourself, for your team. That's where things start to flow, and you get past that sort of beating your head against the wall friction point.
Yeah, I love that. Are you, I'm just going to ask it. Are you an introvert or an extrovert?
I probably lean more towards extrovert. I did the Susan Cain Quiet quiz when Quiet
Nice.
book came out,
Yeah.
and it had me like right in the middle as an ambivert. But no, I definitely thrive on interacting with others, particularly if it's the sort of sharing, co-creation, discussion, debate of ideas, or models or things of that nature. I really have a hard time with. I mean, I'm good at it, but I don't find value in sort of the superficial small chat. I've got a couple groups that I'm a part of that I think I lean in most strongly to them because they do a very deliberate and excellent job of cutting to meaningful conversation very quickly. And yeah, that energizes me for sure. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's hard finding those, because the internet is just filled with surface level,
Yeah.
super predictable conversations. Hey,
Yeah.
great to connect. Yeah, okay. Well, it's like it's part of the game, but it's also like, how can we get to something meaningful here? Whatever that might be.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's important to find those little ecosystems.
Find those and be that, right? Because that's not like, if you're feeling that wandering around going, I wish these conversations were had more depth and meaning. Yeah. So does everyone else. So someone has to go first. And if you lean into that and say, hey, I know we've got all the pleasantries we got to get through. I'm happy to go there. What I'm really excited about is getting to know blah, right? You guys did this at the beginning of the podcast. You went deep quickly. And this is one of the richest conversations I've had on a podcast in a very long time, right? Because of the way you opened it up. And I think it's, when we have a container a box, if you will, to sort of hold that space, then great. But you can do it in one-on-one conversations, right? You can do it with the barista at the coffee shop. Like you can go and every once in a while, people are like, that guy's weird. That woman is way too much for me. But most people don't. Most people go, yes, that was amazing. That was such a breath of fresh air, right? So, yeah. One of my favorite movies of all time is called About Time. Is that one of yours, Miles?
Yeah.
No, you got me on that one.
Bill likes that one? Nice.
Yeah, that's a good movie.
It's a beautiful story, and technically it's about time travel, sort of, but it's not a sci-fi thing. It's Bill Nighy and who's the anyway, whatever. It's a great cast, a beautiful story. The whole point of it is that, I hope I'm not ruining it for people, but there's a bit at the end where this guy has the ability to go back and time travel, but he only goes back to the beginning of that day because he goes through the day as he normally does, and then he goes back and does the day over, just being present. Basically, just showing up with what we're describing here, right? That little bit of spark, the making eye contact with the barista, which is what made me think of it. And, actually playing with your kids, not just being in the room while they're playing. And it's a completely different experience. And of course, we can't do that, the lesson of the story, but we can make the choice to live that second day first. And it's never perfect, right? And I'm as guilty as anyone else of being on my phone with my kids in the room. And if we can do a little bit better today than we did yesterday, right? Then we're making progress.
Mic drop. That was pretty good.
And we're out. I got nothing else. Man. Don't ask me any more questions.
Chris, thank you so much for coming and hanging out with us. I hope that, down the road you'll come back because Lord knows you'll be up to something that you haven't even imagined yet. And we'll need to find out what that is.
It sounds fabulous. Guys, thank you for this. Keep doing what you're doing. It's this is awesome. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris. Cool.
That wraps another episode of The Subtle Art of Not Yelling, your home for creative growth.
If our words have resonated with you, subscribe, share, and leave us a review. It means a lot and helps us reach more creative entrepreneurs.
Join us next week as we continue to explore the art of quietly becoming a creative superpower and thriving without yelling.
Until then, keep nurturing your ideas, honing your craft, and shipping your work.
Because amazing things happen on the other side of finished.